In the early 4th century, the once unified heartland of North China fell into chaos, birthing the era of the 16 kingdoms. Between 304 and 439, over 20 regimes emerged, often led by non-Chinese rulers who claimed imperial titles like Huangdi and Tianwang. These empires thrived amidst a melting pot of cultures, military conquests, and steppe influences. As the Chinese elite sought refuge in the southern Eastern Jin dynasty, the north transitioned into a landscape defined by ranching economies and multi-ethnic communities, embodying an unparalleled fusion of traditions, languages, and identities. Amid this upheaval, the non-Chinese peoples, such as the Xiongnu and Jie, dominated northern China. These groups introduced advanced cavalry tactics, including stirrups and full-body armor, revolutionizing warfare. Leaders like Liu Yuan of the Xiongnu sought legitimacy by drawing connections to ancient Chinese rulers and invoking the mandate of heaven. Despite their non-Chinese origins, they adopted and adapted Chinese governance and culture, with Confucian classics inscribed even in turbulent times. South of the Yangtze, the Eastern Jin dynasty, formed by northern refugees, cultivated a thriving yet fragile state. This era, marked by cultural brilliance, gave rise to iconic figures like the painter Gu Kaizhi and calligrapher Wang Shiji. While the South achieved economic prosperity and artistic heights, the North persisted as a realm of military might and cultural hybridity. The Northern Wei dynasty, established by the Tuoba Xianbei, exemplified this transformation, blending nomadic traditions with Confucian reforms to lay the groundwork for reunification. The 16 Kingdoms era, though fleeting, reshaped China's cultural and political fabric. It exemplified the fluidity of identity, the resilience of governance, and the enduring quest for legitimacy in a fractured world. This tumultuous period ultimately paved the way for the reunification of China, where the legacies of both the northern and southern dynasties merged into a new chapter of Chinese civilization. North China's 16 Kingdoms, 304–439. North China's centralized imperial government nearly fell apart in the early 4th century. For more than a century, the ancient Chinese cultural heartland in the north was divided by what is commonly referred to as the 16 Kingdoms. More specifically, between 304 and 439, historians identify 21 different regimes in North China, not to mention other autonomous local communities that never aspired to become states. Even though these regimes were commonly referred to in English as 16 kingdoms, they frequently operated as actual empires because they were comparatively large, multi-ethnic, military conquest states headed by men who claimed the Chinese title of emperor, Huangdi. Invoking the alternative title of heavenly king, Tianwang, was unusually common during this time, perhaps due to steppe cultural influences. The rulers of the majority of these 16 kingdoms were not of Chinese ethnicity. An eighth of all northern Chinese may have escaped to the relative safety and stability of the south, as North China descended into anarchy during the 4th century. A court in exile, known historically as the Eastern Jin dynasty, 317–420, was re-established by Western Jin imperial family members in the lower Yangtze River Valley, where many of these refugees settled. The Eastern Jin dynasty's capital was now known as Nanjing, or Nanking in English. This was the foundation for 5 southern dynasties: the Eastern Jin, Song, Qi, Liang, and Chen, economically and culturally prosperous but weak politically and militarily. These southern dynasties, including the 3 kingdoms, Wu, a southern state that existed earlier in the 3rd century, are sometimes called the 6 dynasties. Meanwhile, those who stayed in the north huddled behind thousands of makeshift local defenses. During this time, trade and commerce in the north essentially stopped. For almost 200 years, northern China has yet to produce new coins. Throughout northern China, a ranching or herding economy took hold, turning a large portion of farmland into pasture or leaving it undeveloped. The non-Chinese peoples, generally referred to as Hu in Chinese sources and divided into 5 major population groups, eventually came to dominate the northern landscape militarily and politically, and they relied heavily on livestock raising as a basic aspect of their way of life. According to some academics, millions of these originally non-Chinese people lived in northern China in the 4th century. Although they were not necessarily nomads, these people usually placed more emphasis on raising livestock than on Chinese-style agriculture. They also ate a lot of animal meat like mutton and dairy products, which are generally despised in Chinese cuisine. They spoke languages entirely unrelated to Chinese, not just different from it. According to scholarly speculation, one core group, the Ji, may have spoken an Indo-European language at first. Furthermore, it was claimed that at least some of these individuals had unusual physical characteristics, such as full beards, high, i.e., protuberant noses, and deep-set eyes, sometimes even referred to as yellow, though this most likely meant brownish. Importantly, they continued to be aware of their distinct identities, distinguishing them from most people in the former Chinese empires, whom they started calling Han in the 5th or 6th century. However, there is no indication that any of them came from outside of China's current borders in the recent past. In reality, there were no barbarian invasions. A distinctively non-Chinese northern cultural complex developed during the Bronze Age, which was roughly contemporaneous with the Shang dynasty on the Central Plain. This complex reached as far south as the northern regions of the present-day Chinese provinces of Shanxi, Shaanxi, and Hebei. Northern-style nomadic mounted archery was first used in China in 307 BCE by a warring state in northern Shaanxi. It was hardly unusual for non-Chinese to be present in this area. Specifically, Shaanxi has emerged as a hub for non-Chinese activity. The first 16 kingdoms were established in 304 at an existing Xiongnu base in southern Shaanxi by a scion of Xiongnu royalty. No matter how far away they came from, the Jie, the most exotic of the non-Chinese state founders of the 4th century, settled in southern Shaanxi for generations. According to their legends, the most recent and historically significant population group, the Tuoba branch of the Xianbei people, is said to have come from northeastern Inner Mongolia within the present-day borders of China. By the 4th century, even these Tuoba Xianbei had made their home in the area around the northern Yellow River Loop, which included northern Shaanxi. Despite uniting numerous local populations under a single political system, sharing a common written language, and having a widely shared elite culture, the Qin and Han empires continued to be highly multicultural and multi-ethnic. As a defensive buffer along the wide and frequently ill-defined northern border between the areas of steppe-style pastoral nomadism and Chinese-style intensive farming, the Han dynasty also mainly depended on its client non-Chinese tribal allies. As a result, the non-Chinese groups that suddenly appeared in the 4th century had existed for a long period. Many were at least ostensibly Chinese imperial subjects. Their elites occasionally knew a little bit of the Chinese classics, and they spoke some Chinese. Military men could take control of North China when the imperial government fell in the early 300s. The northern non-Chinese peoples were naturally skilled cavalry because they were used to living on horseback. These mounted warriors became truly formidable in the 4th century when they added the stirrup and full armor for both man and horse to their arsenal. North China would continue to be militarily dominated by heavy cavalry from the 4th century to the 6th. At the same time, Chinese definitions of political legitimacy continued to be the most persuasive. Whether or not they were ethnically Chinese, a number of armed bands formed in the early 300s in an attempt to preserve the throne, at least ostensibly uniting to support the legitimate but struggling Jin dynasty. Notably, the first Xiongnu 16 Kingdoms state was established in southern Shaanxi in 304 by a Xiongnu prince who claimed maternal ancestry from Liu Bang, the founder of the Han dynasty, Emperor Han Gaozu. The Xiongnu elite had literally intermarried with Chinese royalty because the early Han dynasty had given Xiongnu leaders imperial brides. Liu Yuan, a specific Xiongnu prince, spent years residing in the Chinese imperial capital and dubbed his new state Han. Invoking legitimacy in Chinese, this same Xiongnu leader claims that King Wen of Zhou and Great Yu, the fabled founder of China's first Xia dynasty, were born among non-Chinese. He came to the conclusion that only virtuous people should be considered when establishing dynasties deserving of the mandate of heaven. The argument was unmistakable. The mandate of heaven did not belong to any particular people, regardless of whether this Xiongnu ruler said it or a Chinese historian later put it in his mouth. Since the Shang had already subdued the Xia and the Zhou had subdued the Shang, the legitimate mandate might be passed down to another group. To a Xiongnu, why not? Whether or not he actually spoke these words, this Xiongnu leader wrote them down in Chinese. Chinese continued to be the dominant written language, with very few exceptions, despite the period's multi-ethnic and multilingual nature, and the fact that clearly non-Chinese individuals were frequently in positions of political and military authority. Even Shi Hu, 295-349, a particularly savage Jie tribal ruler of northeast China in the middle of the 4th century, felt obliged to send a scholar to Luoyang, the former imperial capital, to copy the Confucian classics' stone inscriptions. Some of these ethnic divisions had already started to wane by the late 4th century, even though non-Chinese tribes were present in the center of the 16 kingdoms of the 4th century, which upheld conscious ties of tribal solidarity and managed their Chinese and non-Chinese populations independently. The dynasties of the South, South China, 317 to 589. One imperial prince set up a new headquarters in 307, just south of the Yangtze River, in the city that is now known as Nanjing, as the Western Jin dynasty fell apart in the early 4th century due to bloody civil wars. The first of 5 southern dynasties that claimed to be the only valid line of Chinese imperial succession, this prince took the throne in 317 to become the founding emperor of an Eastern Jin dynasty in exile, following the ultimate fall of the Western Jin. Even though they had a strong claim to superior legitimacy, they were in a vulnerable position. Even though the watery terrain, many rivers, canals, lakes, and flooded rice paddies provided some natural protection against northern cavalry, the south was bewildered by a flood of refugees from the north. It's possible that these recent northern émigrés made up 17% of the population in the south. There was a significant risk of animosity and conflict with the older southern Chinese natives, who in turn continued to be separate from the pre-Chinese aboriginal population of the south, which was still quite sizable as a result of the refugee members of former northern great families carving out large new estates for themselves in the south and tending to dominate the southern dynasty governments. The so-called Mountain Viet, or Shan Yue in Chinese, peoples in the lower Yangtze River region were a major source of conflict for 3 kingdoms Wu in the 3rd century. These were descended from the Hundred Viets, who historically occupied much of southeast China. It was still a frontier area, as recently as the Han dynasty. According to reports, 3 kingdoms Wu forced the surrender of 100,000 mountain Viets in present-day Anhui province during a 3-year campaign that started in 234. The more active members of the group were turned into Wu dynasty soldiers, while the less active became regular farmers who paid taxes. Although the term Mountain Viet was rarely used. After the Three Kingdoms era, many Aborigines lived throughout the southern dynasties under different names. The Eastern Jin dynasty had a surprisingly long period of stability and prosperity, despite the possibility of conflict between ethnic Chinese and Aborigines, between northern refugees and older native Southerners, and with invaders from the 16 kingdoms in the north. Compromise, conciliation, and a comparatively strong balance of power were the keys to the Eastern Jin's somewhat surprising success. The threat of any great family gaining absolute power, when the emperors were especially weak, encouraged all the other families to unite against that family to restore stability. Several exceptional politicians deserve a great deal of credit for their skillful leadership, such as Wang Dao, 276-339. To gain support from the south, Wang Dao, a northern émigré himself, started speaking the local dialect right away. Everybody felt that Wang Dao met them like an old friend, and there were few who could resist Wang Dao's welcome, according to one modern account. China's first truly famous painter, Gu Kaizhi, 341-402, and perhaps the most admired calligraphic genius of all time, Wang Shiji, 303-379, were among the incredible artistic flourishings of the Eastern Jin dynasty. In 353, Wang Shiji threw a sophisticated literary party at an orchid pavilion in Zhejiang, where wine cups drifted down a gently flowing stream. Every time the cup touched the bank, the 41 guests in succession were required to write a poem or risk punishment. Wang Shiji's calligraphy for the preface to the record of this gathering was so highly prized that it is said that a later emperor, Tang Taizong, 600-649, carried the original copy to his tomb. The Eastern Jin era also includes the renowned poet Tao Qian, Tao Wanming, 365-427. Tao is regarded as one of China's first great landscape poets and a champion of the pleasures of a modest, contented life in rural seclusion. He is also well known for writing the short story Peach Blossom Spring, a groundbreaking piece of utopian prose fiction that describes a fisherman who once followed a stream into a grove of peach blossoms and discovered a cave. He discovered a flourishing community cut off from the outside world for centuries as he entered and went through this cave. When he returned home, he reported directly to the government, despite the locals' request that the fishermen keep their existence a secret. But no one was ever able to locate this amazing land again, no matter how hard they searched. Dai Kui, D396, a painter and musician, was another Eastern Jin artistic genius. Dai was well known for playing the qin, a delicate horizontal stringed instrument. According to one story, Dai smashed his qin in front of the messenger when he was asked to perform for a certain prime minister and prince of the imperial family in the year 345. Dai claimed that he was not a performer for princely houses. Despite his alleged rage, the prince could not stop Dai's disobedience. This story demonstrates that gentlemen of this era enjoyed a remarkable degree of independence from imperial power. Since the late Han Dynasty, academic achievement and literary prowess have become necessary prerequisites for achieving high social status and holding public office, contributing significantly to the Southern Dynasty's remarkable cultural splendor. Individual private families became the center of learning and education following the fall of the Han and the waning of the imperial government. One of the key factors that distinguished the great families who dominated society during the division era from common people was literary education. The increasing quantity and diversity of books in imperial and private collections was another element that contributed to the cultural diversity of the southern dynasties. In the middle of the 6th century, one imperial library was said to have up to 140,000 rolls of books and charts. The selections of refined literature, Wenshuan, a significant literary collection that became the text from which most educated men obtained their literary education for centuries to come, and that early Korean and Japanese elites also widely read, was put together by a prince in the early 6th century with about 30,000 rolls. 8. The revolution in writing materials, which in Eastern Jin times had finally replaced wood, silk, and bamboo with true paper, was partially responsible for this proliferation. The southern economy's thriving marketization also contributed to the increased accessibility of books. Significant agricultural growth and the increasing commercialization and privatization of the southern dynasty economy were observed in South China during the Age of Division. By the 5th and 6th centuries, commerce and the flow of money had permeated almost every sphere of society. The commercialization of the economy was further aided by the expanding amount of international maritime trade, which had connected southern Chinese ports with markets as distant as the Mediterranean by late Han times. Surprisingly, China's most significant port from the Han Dynasty to the Age of Division was most likely situated in the Red River Valley region of northern Vietnam, near present-day Hanoi. With a population of 1.4 million, the capital of the Southern Dynasty, present-day Nanjing, was the biggest city in the world by the early 500s because of its commercial vitality. The extraordinary cultural and economic vibrancy of Southern Dynasty China contrasts sharply with the events occurring in Western Europe around the same period. However, the trauma caused by the Roman Empire's fall may occasionally be overstated. There appears to have been a startling decline in Western standards of living during the 5th to 7th centuries. 10. The economic and cultural flourishing of this southern dynasty also starkly contrasts concurrent developments in the original heartland of Chinese civilization in the north. One Buddhist writer from the 6th century even expressed awe at how the central plain in the north had been China, but had now devolved into a barbarian waste, while the south had been barbaric, but was now a Chinese land. North and south appeared to have switched places. However, there were also significant flaws in the southern dynasties. There was a sharp concentration of wealth and knowledge in a few hands. While some benefited greatly from the frenzied process of monetization and commercialization, many independent small farmers appear to have been reduced to complete dependence. Extreme economic polarization has emerged. The first southern dynasty, the Eastern Jin, enjoyed legitimacy and stability until it was overthrown in 420 by a military usurper. All succeeding short-lived southern dynasties were founded by an ambitious general. Internal rivalries and suspicions often caused these new military houses to disintegrate. For instance, Emperor Xiaowu of the Song, R. 454-465, had 28 sons, but none of them died naturally. Instead, they were all murdered by members of their own family. The brutality of the internal conflict was encapsulated in a popular song from around the year 454, which read, "First see son slaughter father, later see younger brother slaughter older brother." Tseit. A weakened sense of national identity might have resulted from a need for greater popular identification with these short-lived and not entirely admirable southern dynasties. Ironically, despite the southern dynasty's cultural genius, one southern writer in the middle of the 6th century, for instance, could dismiss all but a few northern literary endeavors as little more than the braying of assess and the barking of dogs. The non-Chinese regimes in the north may have been better able to preserve a conservative form of traditional Confucianism. 13. The southern dynasties never fully recovered from a devastating rebellion that took place between 548 and 552. Reunification ultimately came from the north, North China, 386-534, Northern Wei. The Xianbei, particularly a subgroup known as the Tuoba, emerged as the most significant non-Chinese peoples in North China as stability started to return after the chaos of the 4th century. Most people think that the Xianbei originated in modern-day Manchuria. Their native region of northeastern Inner Mongolia, just west of Manchuria, is home to Tuoba Xianbei legend. The origins of the Tuoba Xianbei are still unknown, though, and Ural-Altaic, their extinct native language, is situated in the middle of Turkic and Mongolic. The belt of hilly grassland, extending from the Yellow River's northernmost loop in the west to just north of present-day Beijing in the east, is where the Tuoba Xianbei had established their grazing area by the end of the 2nd century. By constructing fortifications and establishing agricultural colonies, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty tried to incorporate this region into the Han Empire. However, by the 3rd century, the Chinese government had mostly withdrawn. This region's diverse population and cultures gave rise to the historic Tuoba Xianbei. A Tuoba leader sent his son to the North Chinese imperial court in 261. As the Western Jin imperial government started to fall apart amid a catastrophic civil war, one faction of the ruling family recruited and others courted the semi-nomadic Tuoba as military auxiliary forces. The Tuoba chieftain was rewarded for his service by Western Jin, who made him the first duke, and by 315 made him king of Dai, a Chinese administrative unit close to their grazing area. A meeting of the tribes near present-day Hohhot in Inner Mongolia restored Tuoba independence in 386 after the Western Jin dynasty briefly subjugated the Tuoba Xianbei and incorporated them into one of the numerous non-Chinese empires of the 4th century North. The Tuoba ruler quickly changed the name of his state from Dai to Wei, a distinguished Chinese state name, and elevated his title from king to emperor. This marked the start of the Northern Wei dynasty, 386–534, as it is known in history. The formerly semi-nomadic Northern Wei emperor founded a new permanent capital close to present-day Datong in northern Shaanxi province in 398 and started establishing an agricultural foundation in the area. Northern Wei resettled on a massive scale around their capital and used a lot of captive labor. More than 1 million people were forcibly relocated by the Northern Wei in the first half of the 5th century, including Chinese, members of other Xianbei subgroups, Xiongnu, and people from northern Korea. The Northern Wei contributed to the dissolution of previous identities and created a new, more unified Northern Wei identity by drastically moving and rearranging population groups in this way. North China had been conquered and reunited by the Northern Wei by 439. Nevertheless, Northern Wei remained a distinctly Xianbei dynasty for a long time. Millions of head of cattle, sheep, horses, and camels are mentioned in historical records, demonstrating how important livestock grazing remained to the Northern Wei economy. Hunting wild game, frequently with hawks or falcons, has maintained its economic importance and remained a popular pastime of the Northern Wei elite, well into the 5th century. A poor harvest in 415 prompted a proposal to relocate the capital further south into the Chinese heartland. However, a counter-argument won out, claiming that the Chinese would believe the Tuoba Xianbei had enormous armies as long as they were in the north. Their low actual numbers would be revealed if the capital were moved to the south. They should remain in the north to strike the south as soon as possible, because seeing the dust from their horses' hooves would make the Chinese shudder and surrender. Said to be the recently rediscovered original Tuoba Xianbei ancestral temple in a cave in isolated northeastern Inner Mongolia, the Northern Wei dispatched an emissary in 443 to perform sacrifices there. They recorded it in dynastic history and carved a commemorative inscription into the cavern wall, regardless of whether this was the Tuoba Xianbei's ancestral home. Remarkably, this same cave was rediscovered by archaeologists in 1980, complete with its 5th century inscription. With some caveats, this archaeological find remarkably supports the conventional historical narrative. Minor but intriguing deviations from the text of the rediscovered inscription are documented in the dynasty's history. Specifically, the dynastic history did not use the term Khan, which the original inscription used for early Tuoba Xianbei rulers, possibly the earliest known use of that now familiar nomadic title. This disparity serves as a reminder that the Northern Wei dynasty might not have been as fully Chinese as conventional histories authored by Chinese authors in the Chinese language indicate. Nonetheless, the non-Chinese word Khan is still written in Chinese characters in this original inscription. Northern Wei emperors ruled North China essentially as Xianbei-style overlords until the middle of the 5th century. They did not see themselves as the only legitimate heirs to the Chinese mandate of heaven, and they showed little sign of a strong desire to subjugate the southern dynasties, which were still independent, and reunite China. Furthermore, most senior Northern Wei officials continued to be clearly non-Chinese. But in 494, Northern Wei moved its capital to Luoyang, the sacred early Chinese imperial site, further south. Before that, the court started enacting policies to make Northern Wei more like a Chinese-style government, first under the leadership of a strong Empress Dowager, and later under Emperor Xiaowen, or 471-500. A Confucian temple was constructed, seasonal sacrifices were offered to the spirit of Confucius. Chinese names were adopted, such as Yuan, replacing the non-Chinese imperial surname Tuoba, and the use of Chinese in court was required as part of the court's actions. These acts were likely motivated more by the desire to prepare the way for a Northern Wei conquest of the south and reunification of China than by any apparent superiority or beauty of Chinese culture. The Equitable Fields, Junidan system, a remarkable per capita state farmland allocation system, was one of the new policies. The early Japanese institutions were greatly influenced by the Equitable Fields system, used in China from about 485 to 780. It is also an intriguing illustration of an early government attempt to control the economy in an invasive manner. The Northern Wei per capita farmland assignment originated more directly from the non-Chinese Xianbei practice of using captive labor to till the fields, even though it drew on ancient Confucian egalitarian ideals. According to the semi-nomadic Xianbei, farming remained a lowly, subservient profession. The enormous population displacement and vast unused lands that marked war-ravaged North China in the 4th and 5th centuries were the only factors that allowed for the imperfect implementation of such an equitable field system. The private commercial development that defined the modern southern dynasties was more indicative of long-term Chinese trends than the equitable fields system, which, despite its historical significance, was an exception to the general pattern of Chinese economic history. Adopting Confucian principles was necessary because many Xianbei people needed to become more literate in Chinese, even after the Northern Wei capital was moved to Luoyang in 494. They translated the classic of filial piety into Xianbei. Around this time, a number of books are said to have been written in the Xianbei language, though today only a few words in Chinese transcription remain in their language. It might have been more successful for the Northern Wei imperial order to dress in Chinese attire. Conversely, the new norm for Chinese men's attire was the adoption of Xianbei-style tunics, pants, and boots. The Tuoba Xianbei people, however, eventually came to regard themselves as descended from the same early legendary figures as the Chinese, including the mythical Yellow Emperor. The original Mulan, a well-known Chinese tale from the contemporary Disney animated film, might have been written by the Northern Wei, a dynasty that became so genuinely Chinese. Even though modern southern dynasties would have contested this at the time, the dynasty was eventually seen as the only legitimate owner of the Chinese mandate of heaven and a legitimate Chinese dynasty. One historian from the 7th century even claimed that Emperor Xiaowen of the Northern Wei's efforts were why the Tao of China did not fall during the centuries of division following the reunification of China in 589. The Xieyun, a rhyming dictionary compiled in 601 by a 7th-generation descendant of a Tuoba Xianbei chieftain, established a significant standard for correct pronunciation of the Chinese language. Interestingly, Tabgetch, the Turkic variant of the Tuoba tribe's name, is now a generic Central Asian name for China. Those who stayed in the far north and others who joined them did not join the Xianbei, who migrated south into China and eventually joined the existing population to create a new Chinese synthesis. Xianbei-style cavalry, particularly that based in 6 garrisons at the northern loop of the Yellow River, continued to be the foundation of Northern Wei military might. Potential nomadic invaders from the steppe might attack China from the strategic grasslands south of the Gobi Desert, which these garrisons controlled. However, the soldiers in these frontier garrisons felt that the China-focused Northern Wei court in Luoyang was increasingly neglecting them. In 524, a rebellion broke out from the 6 garrisons, which led to the Northern Wei dynasty being split in half, east and west, by 534. Soon after, the so-called Eastern and Western Wei dynasties experienced more usurpations and dynastic transitions. A major resurgence of Xianbei culture and identity followed, along with a backlash against the Chinese-style policies of the late Northern Wei government. The names of Xianbei were reinstated. In the middle of the 6th century, some aspirational Chinese even adopted Xianbei names and acquired the Xianbei language. However, the regime in the northwest also started making extraordinary attempts to integrate ethnic Chinese into its military at the same time, in part due to the limited supply of Xianbei warriors. This regime started deliberately bringing up the memory of ancient Zhou standards and ideals, possibly because its base area was the same, within the passes, which had been the ancient Zhou and Qin homeland. This regime, now known as the Sui dynasty, based in the northwest region, within the passes, finally reunified China in 589, following yet another usurpation and change of dynastic houses. Global elite cosmopolitan culture. China's cultural diversity was its most striking feature in the 6th century. In North China, the language of military command, the rulers, and a large portion of the army were all still clearly non-Chinese Xianbei as late as the 570s. These non-Chinese warriors occasionally made shocking, insulting remarks about ethnic Chinese farmers and civilian officials, referring to them as Han dogs. Nevertheless, many Xianbei had already absorbed much Chinese culture. A strong warlord from northeastern China in the middle of the 6th century, Gao Huan became famous for urging his Xianbei warriors to treat the Chinese as valuable servants and to avoid mistreating them. Additionally, he reminded the Chinese that the Xianbei were their guardians and that they ought to be fed and clothed without hostility. According to historical records, he was the grandson of a Chinese attendant censor from the eastern Central Plain who had been exiled to a frontier garrison in the northwest Ordos Desert. Despite his apparent fluency in Chinese and Xianbei, this man adopted a more Xianbei culture after 2 generations. As a result, some contemporary academics contend that his claim of Chinese ancestry must have been a fabrication. Although it is possible that he was of Chinese descent, albeit possibly not from as illustrious a family as he claimed, such genealogical fraud may have been advantageous and feasible. His assertion of Chinese ancestry might have appeared credible. Ultimately, there is no evidence in either direction, and the uncertainty surrounding his identity highlights a significant aspect of this period. This era had a mixed and hybrid culture. Rich Chinese started incorporating foreign products like Hu beds, an early folding chair, and cooking methods as early as the 3rd century. Even unexpected distances were occasionally the source of foreign influences. According to reports, a silver pitcher discovered in the tomb of a garrison commander who perished in 569 in northwest China, present-day Ningxia, was crafted in Afghanistan in the Persian style and embellished with Trojan war scenes. The South remained open to diverse contacts, maintained a mixed population, and upheld ethnic Chinese rule throughout the Age of Division. According to historical records, the court of the 6th century Southern dynasty was frequently visited by embassies from Southeast Asia, India, Persia, Central Asia, and the nearby Korean peninsula. Some academics even contend that evidence of Greek influence can be seen in the stone pillars at some imperial tombs in the south. China was incredibly vulnerable to external influences during this age of division, some of which originated in unexpectedly remote places. But this time, it also established important cultural traits that define East Asia. During this time, a comparatively common elite culture expanded throughout East Asia, reaching modern-day China, Korea, Japan, and northern Vietnam. During this time, the local East Asian elites shared more than the peasants in neighboring villages. East Asia came into being during this time. One important aspect of this new East Asian cultural community that connected it to the wider world was Buddhism. Buddhism arrives in East Asia. Origins in India. The world's first significant missionary religion was Buddhism. During those same centuries of political division in China, a common religious faith in Buddhism united much of the world, including parts of Southeast Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, and much of South Asia. South Asia was, of course, the birthplace of Buddhism. Around the 6th century BCE, Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the sage of the Shakya tribe, Shakyamuni, was born in the area that is now Nepal. He is the historical Buddha, the enlightened one. He reportedly came to the revolutionary insight that nothing in the material existence is permanent and has no higher purpose, even though it is an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth known to the Indians as samsara. What is the meaning of life? The age-old religious question. In response, the Buddha said that life is meaningless. After you die, your permanent personal identity is not passed down to subsequent incarnations. Instead, your identity's different parts disperse and reassemble in novel ways. Everything changes, and this unending change lacks a clear direction. Everything is just the result of earlier causes, leading to further effects, and so on. Ultimately, existence is pointless. Breaking free from this never-ending cycle of suffering is the only way to become truly enlightened. The Buddha's first sermon, in which he articulated the Four Noble Truths, was prompted by this insight: life is suffering, which is the first noble truth. According to the second noble truth, the main source of our suffering is our attachment to material belongings. With brutal logic, the third noble truth follows. The only way to end our suffering is to break those attachments and desires. This can be accomplished by following the eightfold path of proper living, as explained in the fourth and final truth. Nirvana, or the end of reincarnation, may eventually be attained if one successfully severs all attachments. The Four Noble Truths are regarded as the central tenets of Buddhism, but they have yet to receive widespread attention in Chinese Buddhism. The bitter sea of existence has no end, but just turn your head, and there is the shore, is a well-known proverb that sums up the fundamental Chinese perspective on Buddhism. That is, despite life's never-ending sufferings, one can find release through a simple realization of the truth. Furthermore, many Chinese and other East Asian Buddhists did not believe that a sudden enlightenment or a rigorous path of spiritual detachment from desires offered the best chance of salvation. Rather, it appeared to be based on a straightforward belief that asks a bodhisattva, an enlightened character who decided to remain in this world to aid others, to save them and bring rebirth in paradise. Amitabha, the bodhisattva of infinite life and infinite light, was the most significant of these bodhisattvas. He had vowed to reincarnate anyone who invoked his name earnestly in the Western Pure Land. The Mahayana, greater vehicle school of Buddhism, which claims universal salvation, is the most common in East Asia. The Buddha and bodhisattvas are revered as gods in this tradition, and rebirth in paradise is frequently seen as a more immediate objective than nirvana. The earlier accounts of the Buddha's initial realization differ greatly from this form of Buddhism. In that case, it is difficult to confidently speak about the original Buddhism because few trustworthy records from the earliest period and numerous variations of Buddhism have emerged quickly. Buddhism quickly developed into a highly intricate and sophisticated religion that defies easy categorization. One of the three major collections of Buddhist scriptures that have survived are the Tibetan and Southeast Asian, or Pali, canons. For instance, the standard modern edition of the Chinese Buddhist canon contains about 2,184 distinct complete texts. Furthermore, a vast number of texts have yet to survive. By the 3rd century BCE, there were Buddhists in South Asia from Sri Lanka in the south to Gandhara in the northwest, in present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. The earliest Buddhist community may have arisen in the Ganges River valley of northeastern India. In the meantime, real Greeks had arrived in that same region of present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan due to Alexander the Great's conquests, 356–323 BCE. Menander, a Greek king in that area, is said to have become a Buddhist around 160 BCE. The outcome was a rich blend of Indian, Persian, and Hellenistic cultural elements. Some cultural and artistic influences started to spread eastward into China because the main Silk Road trade routes also went through this area. Stone grotto temples, where Indian holy men performed their austerities, first appeared in India as early as the 2nd century BCE. Buddha images were first produced in the Gandhara region in the 1st century CE. From there, Buddhist statues and cave temples went to East Asia and China. Northern China is home to more than 120 cave temples, the oldest of which date back to the 5th century. As far east as Korea, this type of cave temple was practiced. The end effect clearly manifested the Buddhist cultural ties that bind the whole region, from contemporary Afghanistan to Korea. The largest Buddhist statues in the world were demolished by the Taliban in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, sometime in the 6th century. One of the best examples in China is the Yungang complex of Buddhist grottos, primarily built between 460 and 494 and located close to the capital of the Northern Wei dynasty, at present-day Datong. There are about 51,000 Buddhist images in the Yungang complex, with the tallest statue at about 55,000 feet. Even in certain areas of Buddhist practice, there were significant regional variations, even as Buddhism brought together large regions of Asia into a single religious community. For instance, building cave temples was uncommon in South China and did not spread to Japan. Developed in China by the 5th century, the pagoda is a distinctively East Asian Buddhist symbol that combined imported Indian religious elements with older tower architecture from the Han dynasty. In East Asia, Korean pagodas were stone, Japanese pagodas were wood, and Chinese pagodas were masonry. As Buddhism spread throughout China, a new indigenous Taoist religion emerged that interacted intricately with it. Its foundations included the classical god Laozi, divinely revealed texts, an underworld bureaucracy, and older Chinese beliefs regarding the possibility of physical immortality. But it was not until this time that the scriptures, priests, and temples of a distinctly Taoist religion started to take shape. By the 5th century, several new Taoist texts were clearly based on Buddhist sutras, though concepts like rebirth that were initially alien to Buddhism were also adapted to fit the somewhat different Taoist goals. At the same time, Buddhism was changing in China. China is now a Buddhist country. Buddhism made its way to China through the maritime trade routes through Southeast Asia and the caravan trade routes through Central Asia. Travel by sea was prohibited by pre-Buddhist Indian Brahmanical teachings. Nevertheless, Avalokiteshvara, a Buddhist bodhisattva of compassion, became a patron saint of travelers, empowering traders to confront the imagined and actual perils of long-distance travel in antiquity. Perhaps because of this, many early Indian traders were Buddhists, and monks frequently traveled with them. This Indian deity, Avalokiteshvara, eventually came to be frequently, though not always, portrayed in female form in China as the adored goddess of mercy Guanyin, Kannon in Japanese, Kwanum in Korean, in a charming illustration of Buddhism's capacity to adapt and change locally. Chinese women often prayed to her, hoping that Guanyin would assist them in having a male child. Much later, in Tibet, the esteemed Buddhist leaders known as the Dalai Lamas, a title that dates back to 1578, also came to be seen as manifestations of Avalokiteshvara, referred to as Chenrezig in the local dialect. By the early 1st century, Buddhism had made its way to China, although it was initially unpopular. The introduction of new foreign gods was not necessarily prohibited by the pre-existing native Chinese religious beliefs, which acknowledged various spirits. However, the early Buddhist missionary monks looked extremely bizarre, pleading for their existence with bare feet, shaved heads, saffron robes, and bare right shoulders. Most fundamentally, the typically upbeat Chinese tradition of active worldly participation ran counter to the Buddhist message of retreating from a miserable world. The Buddhist objective of leaving the family and society to become a celibate monk directly opposed the Confucian values of service to the family, community, and state. As a result, Buddhism only gradually spread throughout China. In the 3rd century, the first Chinese person was ordained as a Buddhist monk. Buddhism was mostly restricted to the foreign community for the first 300 years or so that it existed in China. Buddhism found a more accepting audience in the 4th century when the imperial government in North China fell and a period of widespread ethnocultural change began. The purported ability of Buddhism to perform miracles was a major factor in its appeal at the time. In early 4th century South China, for example, an Indian missionary is said to have enthralled audiences by cutting his tongue with a knife, reattaching it, and then setting the paper in a fire, only to recover it whole from the ashes. Arriving from the western regions in the Chinese imperial capital Luoyang in 310, just as the city was falling to non-Chinese conquerors, the renowned missionary monk Fo-tu Cheng, d. 348, was skilled at reciting supernatural incantations and able to marshal demons. When he presented himself to a significant 16 kingdoms commander, Fo-tu Cheng filled his begging bowl with water, burned incense, and prayed, miraculously causing a blue lotus flower to bloom. He would smear sesame oil mixed with rouge in his hand, and affairs from 1,000 li beyond could all be observed in his palm, as though right before your face. Because Fo-tu Cheng possessed such amazing supernatural abilities, the throne accepted him as a trusted advisor. Some argue that because Buddhism was unfamiliar to them, the non-Chinese rulers of the northern dynasties were especially receptive. Indeed, according to textual sources, at least one northern ruler in the 4th century made such a claim. However, in the 5th and 6th centuries, the native Chinese southern dynasties of this period carried out none of the 4 most infamous purges of Buddhism in Chinese history, whereas the non-Chinese northern dynasties carried out 2. These Buddhist purges in the north may have been motivated, at least in part, by a desire to establish their legitimacy as Chinese-style empires. Furthermore, The northern dynasties were typically more strict in their control over Buddhism than the southern dynasties, and government oversight and regulation of the Buddhist clergy started in the north in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Meanwhile, Buddhism had gained respect in the south, thanks to the philosophical sophistication and skillful conversational exchanges of some eminent Buddhist monks from the 4th century. Buddhism flourished among Chinese and non-Chinese people in the north and the south. In contrast to medieval Europe, Chinese governments did assert their power to control religion and the idea that the state was superior to the other church early on. In pre-modern China, however, there was no official state church to which everyone was supposed to belong, with very few exceptions. The government was worried about stifling possible uprisings motivated by religion and restricting the number of tax exemptions for religion. Apart from that, the government generally accepted different religious beliefs. The level of religious freedom enjoyed by pre-modern Chinese people was surprisingly high. Because of this, China was never a purely Buddhist civilization, even though Buddhism was very popular there at its height. If Indian Buddhists supposedly viewed the endless round of existence as a curse and nirvana as a release from the cycle of reincarnation, in China, ironically, the previously unfamiliar Indian idea of reincarnation, of rebirth, seemed to imply a promise of eternal life, which, for many Chinese people, was not unappealing. Reincarnation also solved the classic moral conundrum of why good people often experience bad things. The next life rewards their good deeds. In China, Buddhists came to believe that after death, one could either go to hell for a period of punishment, where Yama, in Chinese Yan Wang, the god of the dead, judges evildoers, be doomed to haunt the land as a hungry ghost, be reborn as an animal, be reborn as a human, be reborn in a paradise, such as the Pure Land in the West, or be reborn as a kind of demon called an asura. It's not surprising that Buddhism changed from India to China. Not only did the cultural backgrounds diverge significantly, but there was a significant linguistic gap between the Indian languages, where the concepts of Buddhism initially emerged, and Chinese. For centuries, the first priority of Buddhists in China was translation. In the early period, the region in far northwest China today, called Xinjiang, played a critical role in the transmission process. Many early Buddhist translators were not actually Indians, but Central Asians, many of them from Xinjiang. People have rightfully referred to Xinjiang as the crossroads of Eurasia. The principal Silk Road trade routes lay north and south of the Tarim Basin Desert, which occupies Xinjiang's heart. Despite bringing Xinjiang into the Chinese Empire as early as the 2nd century BCE, China only sporadically included it within its borders after that, and its culture and population remained largely un-Chinese for a long time. For example, in parts of Xinjiang, such as Kucha, an oasis community on the northern branch of the Silk Roads, an Indo-European language called Tocharian continued to be spoken until the 9th century. From Kucha, the greatest early Buddhist translators came: Kumarajva, 344–4113. Kumarajva was born in Kucha, reportedly to an Indian father and a local mother, and as a boy he traveled with his mother to Kashmir, in India, learning the languages of various lands. In 384, Kucha and Kumarajva were captured by one of the 16 kingdoms regimes in North China. On his return from Kucha, the victorious general needed 20,000 camels to carry all his loot. Together with this loot came the Buddhist master Kumarajva. Eventually, Kumarajva settled in the old Han dynasty capital at Chang'an, in the historical region within the passes. There, Kumarajva assembled a team of 800 scholars and embarked on a major translation project, which may have done more than any other to make the Indian scriptures readably available in Chinese, although even the vastly talented Kumarajva still lamented that much was lost in translation. Over time, many Chinese pilgrims went to India and other Western destinations to study Buddhism at its source. The most famous early Chinese pilgrim was Faxian, traveled throughout South Asia in 399–412 and left an important record of his journeys. However, traveling to India did not alleviate the language barrier. There was simply no way to avoid using Chinese words to translate or at least explain Indian concepts, in the process inevitably involving pre-existing Chinese ideas. As Muzi, late 2nd century, an early Chinese apologist for Buddhism, said when asked why he responded to questions about Buddhism with answers drawn from the Confucian classics, "If I were to speak the words of the Buddhist sutras, it would be like speaking of the 5 colors to a blind person or playing the 5 sounds to a deaf person." Existing Chinese words and ideas served as filters for Buddhism. Although Muzi drew on Confucian principles and most Chinese Buddhists were at pains to emphasize the fundamental compatibility of Buddhism with Confucianism, in the long run, Taoist terminology was most influential in translating the Indian Buddhist ideas and shaping Chinese interpretations of Buddhism. For example, nirvana was sometimes translated into Chinese using Laozi's favorite expression, wu wei, non-action. It has been suggested that the title of an important Chinese Pure Land Buddhist text, the Sutra of Longevity Without Measure, Wu Liang Shu Jing, betrays a Taoist-inspired quest for immortality that is quite at odds with the Indian notion of the goal of nirvana as extinction. A Chinese monk, credited with laying some of the theoretical foundations of what became Pure Land Buddhism, Tan Luan, 476–542, was a northerner seeking the immortality techniques of a famous Taoist at Mao Mountain in the south. There he received a Taoist classic of immortality, but on returning to the northern capital, he supposedly encountered an Indian monk who conferred on him the allegedly superior Buddhist sutra contemplating longevity without measure, Guanwu Liang Shou Jing. Longevity without measure, or infinite life, was another name for the Bodhisattva Amitabha. This story nicely illustrates the complex swirling patterns of interaction between North and South, Chinese and non-Chinese, and Buddhism and Taoism that characterized this age of cosmopolitanism. The claim that all beings already possess the Buddha nature, Foxing, marked a significant milestone in the Chinese domestication of Buddhism starting in the 5th century. The key to salvation is, therefore, already inherent in all things. A particularly important text for Chinese Buddhists was the Sutra of the Lotus of the Wonderful Law, Miao Fa Lianhua Jing, or the Lotus Sutra. The actual Indian origins of this sutra are obscure, but it was claimed that this Lotus Sutra contained the final sermon that the Buddha had preached on Vulture Peak before he attained nirvana. In it, the Buddha explains that what he had said previously about nirvana was not exactly the whole truth, but merely an expedient intended to elevate the consciousness of his listeners. The ultimate truth is that nirvana is not real extinction. You only need to awaken to the Buddha nature that exists in all things to find salvation. By the 6th century, several distinctively Chinese forms of Buddhism emerged, largely without precedent in India. In addition, approximately 1/3 of all the scriptures in the Chinese Buddhist canon are considered apocryphal, meaning they are original Chinese compositions rather than translations from Indian texts. In other words, Buddhism was undergoing domestication and transformation into Chinese culture. Of course, most ordinary faithful were little concerned with fine, scripture-based scholastic distinctions. The promise of rebirth in paradise, the threat of hell, and stories of karmic retribution, good and bad deeds being justly rewarded, excited popular enthusiasm. Buddhism eventually became popularized in China through public sermons, consisting of excerpts from the sutras followed by prose and poetic explanations. People often highlighted the entertainment value of the stories to enhance the appeal of the Buddhist message. A famous master would summon an audience for a sermon, and each arrival would make a small cash donation to cover the cost of incense. The priest would ascend his dais holding a ruyi, a Chinese-style scepter, amid clouds of incense, and the sermon would begin. China not only influenced Buddhism, but Buddhism also significantly transformed China. Religion profoundly influenced Chinese art, especially statuary, as it developed during this period. Buddhist temples and pagodas became characteristic features of the Chinese and East Asian landscape. Buddhism enriched the scope of Chinese literary forms, introducing fables, parables, and Indian-style hymns. The knowledge of Indian phonetic writing systems, introduced with Buddhism, may have contributed to the invention of a new Chinese system for indicating pronunciation using combinations of two characters, and, for the first time, to the conscious recognition and analysis of the tones of spoken Chinese. During the Age of Division, Chinese people transitioned from kneeling to sitting cross-legged, presumably due to Buddhist influence, and also introduced the chair from the Northwest during these centuries. Buddhist abhorrence of killing led to the end of the ancient practice of sacrificing live animals in religious ceremonies. During the Age of Division, it became quite fashionable for Chinese people to adopt Sanskrit or other Buddhist names. A Chinese emperor who ascended the throne in 307, for example, went by the childhood name Shramana, Sanskrit for monk. One 6th-century man styled himself Bodhisattva. Another styled himself Arhat, Sanskrit for holy man. And the founding emperor of one 6th-century dynasty in northwest China styled himself Dharan, Sanskrit for magical verses. Many people included the Chinese character for monk, Seng, in their personal names. By the end of the Age of Division, there were thousands of Buddhist temples throughout China, and, by some reports, millions of monks and nuns. One devout 6th-century southern emperor donated his person to the Buddhist church 4 times, obliging his government to lavishly ransom him on each occasion. A contemporary complained, perhaps with some exaggeration, that the empire had lost almost half its population to the Buddhist monasteries. People said that China had more copies of the Buddhist scriptures by the late 6th century than the Confucian classics. As a final example of the pervasiveness of Buddhism in 6th century China, the powerful emperor who would finally reunify China, in 589, Yang Jian 541-604, was born in a Buddhist monastery and raised as a child by a Buddhist nun who gave him a Sanskrit baby name. It was from China that Buddhism spread to Korea and Japan, but from a China that was also both divided and part of a much larger Buddhist world. For example, Buddhism was first introduced to the northernmost Korean kingdom of Koguryo in 372 by an apparently Chinese monk, Sundo in Korean and Shundao in Chinese, sent by one of the non-Chinese regimes of 4th century northern China. In contrast, Buddhism was separately introduced to the southwestern Korean kingdom of Paekche in 384 by a non-Chinese monk, Malananda, sent by a so-called native Chinese southern dynasty. Despite the international flavor of early East Asian Buddhism, Chinese cultural influences intermixed with the religion's transmission. In 541, for example, the Korean kingdom of Paekche requested and received from southern dynasty China not only copies of the Buddhist sutras, but also physicians, artisans, painters, and specialists in the Confucian classic, the Book of Odes. Most critically, it was in the Chinese language translation that the scriptures of Buddhism spread to Korea and Japan, in conjunction with the introduction of writing. In Korea, it took some time for Buddhism to diffuse from the level of the elite to ordinary people. For instance, the Paekche Kingdom concentrates the known sites of Buddhist temples in a limited area around its successive capitals rather than in the outlying regions of the realm. In the meantime, Korea, particularly Paekchi, introduced Buddhism to Japan. Korean monks were led in constructing the earliest Japanese Buddhist temples in the Korean style. For example, the Hokoji, a temple known as Asukadera, was completed in 596 by artisans and priests from Paekche. The Japanese Buddhist Church's first official head, Sojo, in 623, was an immigrant priest from Korea. Although it is impossible to say when the first person with knowledge of Buddhism landed in the Japanese islands, the dates conventionally given for introducing Buddhism are either 552 or 538. Interestingly, one of the earliest native Japanese histories presents the court debate that supposedly ensued in 552 over whether to accept Buddhism precisely in terms of foreign versus native, with one minister arguing that because all the western frontier lands without exception worshipped the Buddha, Japan should not alone refuse to join them. Conversely, others countered that the Japanese might face the wrath of their national gods if they started to worship foreign deities. Because this book of history was not actually compiled until 720, long after the events it describes, and because the account may be colored by special interests, it should be read with caution. However, there is little doubt that Buddhism was at the forefront of a powerful wave of continental influences swept across Japan in these centuries. These influences came most immediately from Korea, but were more broadly East Asian. Beyond East Asia, Japanese art of the 7th and 8th centuries has claimed some Indian, Persian, and even Mediterranean influences. An actual person from India supposedly officiated at the ceremony opening the eyes of an enormous bronze statue of the Buddha that was cast in Japan in 752. At the same time, early Japanese Buddhism also retained aspects of local native culture. For example, many of the first Buddhist professionals in 6th century Japan were unmarried young ladies, reflecting the indigenous tradition of shrine maidens, miko, in pre-Buddhist Japanese religion. Many early Japanese temples were also clan temples, ujidera, reflecting the importance of the clan in pre-Buddhist Japanese society and religion. Japanese Buddhism absorbed many local pre-Buddhist spirits, kami, a phenomenon observable everywhere the Buddhist religion spread, beginning in India. By 623, there were reportedly 46 Buddhist temples in Japan, all clustered near the capital. With the turn of the 8th century, a newly systematized Japanese imperial government began vigorously promoting Buddhism throughout the islands. In 741, for example, the central government ordered the construction of a Buddhist monastery and a nunnery in every province. Japan became a thoroughly Buddhist land, perhaps even more so than either China or Korea. Despite Buddhism's early transplantation and flourishing in Japan, some argue that it wasn't until the 15th century that the religion finally became a part of ordinary daily life, monopolizing funeral services and ancestral sacrifice in Japan. The emergence of Korean kingdoms. By the 7th century, as Buddhism took root in Japan, the massive age of division finally ended in China. This Chinese age of division coincides with the dawn of recorded history for Korea and Japan, and the first stirrings of a culturally coherent East Asian region. However, humans had already inhabited both the Korean peninsula and the Japanese islands for thousands of years before this time. Both Korea and Japan enjoyed lengthy and culturally rich prehistoric eras. For instance, the Korean peninsula produced pottery as early as 10,000 BCE. In Korea, an age of megalithic, large stone monuments, strikingly reminiscent of the dolmens of prehistoric Europe, began around 2000 BCE. 4 upright stone slabs, capped by an overhanging horizontal lid, typically form the northern-style dolmens in Korea, roughly in the shape of a stone table. Some of these are very large. while dolmens in the southern style, lacking the large uplifting vertical side pieces, are commonly associated with burials. Table-shaped dolmen's purpose remains unclear. Estimates of the total number of prehistoric stone monuments in Korea range as high as an astonishing 100,000. While dolmens can also be found in adjacent regions beyond the Korean peninsula, they are concentrated in Korea and were evidently an indigenous development. The prehistoric cultural complex in Korea had incorporated rice farming and bronze metalworking by the last millennium BCE. The origins of rice cultivation likely lay in southern China, but the Chinese cultural heartland in the north, where millet, and later wheat, was the staple grain, saw little rice cultivation. North China may have influenced bronze, yet Korea lacks the characteristic Chinese-style bronze ritual vessels commonly used for daggers and mirrors. In several ways, therefore, late prehistoric culture in Korea was distinct from that of the Central Plain in China. Korea, which can be viewed in some ways as a peninsular extension of Manchuria, and which was closely associated with Manchuria in early times, may have also been exposed to wider influences from the Eurasian steppe, possibly including the craft of making wrought iron, in contrast to Chinese-style cast iron. However, the first written accounts of what we now call Korea come from Chinese sources. After the wars surrounding the collapse of the Qin Empire and the founding of the Han Dynasty, Weeman, a refugee from an unstable peripheral Han client kingdom called Yan in southeastern Manchuria, fled to northern Korea and established a small kingdom in 195 BCE. Weeman's new kingdom was called Chosun. He ruled over a mixed population of natives and refugees, themselves probably better understood as Yan people than Han Chinese. Over 3 generations, friction developed between this Chosun kingdom and the Han dynasty, and in 108 BCE, Emperor Wu of the Han dynasty invaded and conquered Chosun. At the height of the Han conquest, the Han Empire may have directly incorporated the northern half of the Korean peninsula. At least some northern Koreans remained under Chinese rule for 4 centuries until the late 3rd or early 4th century CE. The principal seat of Chinese rule was Lelang, in Korean, Nangneng, an administrative city near modern Pyongyang. Archaeological evidence makes it clear that local cultures in Korea remained distinct from the standards of the Chinese Central Plain. However, the Han Dynasty Chinese administration in Korea was just as much, if not more, a product of foreign imperial colonial rule as it was in several other regions of the multi-ethnic Han Empire. Under the early Chinese Empire, it was not uncommon for local culture to vary from metropolitan imperial standards. As late as the Han Dynasty, it has even been suggested that the language spoken near what is now Beijing may have been still foreign to the Chinese ear, and rather close to the languages spoken in the northern part of the Korean peninsula. If the native populations under Han Dynasty rule in Korea remained culturally distinct from the Chinese imperial metropolitan elite, they did not yet constitute a unified and homogeneous Korean people. Internally, there remained a surprising variety of different ethnic groups, and externally, the borders of anything that might be called Korea had yet even to be imagined. Although as a peninsula, the geographic map of Korea might appear to have been drawn by the very hand of nature itself. The modern land border in the north, which now follows the line of the Yalu and Tumen rivers, was not actually fixed until as late as the 15th century CE. In 1784, an influential Korean book asserted that the peninsula merely represented the southern portion of a broader Korean identity, extending further north into Manchuria. In the south, even the water's edge was not necessarily an inevitable endpoint. The 3rd century appears to have been an area connected by water rather than separated by it, across which one of the most common scenes must have been people going back and forth in their boats. On a clear day, Tsushima can be seen from Korea. a 3rd century Chinese history, the Sangguo Ji, or Chronicles of the Three Kingdoms, describes several different peoples occupying the general area we now call Korea. The Puyo lived well north of the peninsula in central Manchuria and might not seem relevant, except that according to Korean legend, the Puyo were directly ancestral to other, more obviously Korean peoples, such as Koguryo. To the south of the Puyo in southern Manchuria and in the Chinese Han Dynasty-administered area of northern Korea, the kingdom of Koguryo was emerging. Koguryo had completely replaced the Chinese government in northern Korea by the early 4th century. Koguryo was said to be a splinter group of the Puyo and resembled them in language and culture. East of Koguryo, bordering on the ocean, were the Oksho people, whose language was slightly different from that of Koguryo. South of the Oksho were the Yemaik, or Ye people, living along the eastern seaboard of the Korean peninsula. In the southern half of the peninsula, beyond the maximum zone of the Han Dynasty Chinese administration, were the 3 Korean Han peoples. The Korean Han name differs significantly from the Chinese Han Dynasty despite their similar pronunciation. Since a kingdom emerged from one of these 3 Han, Zamhan, peoples in the southeast, they were likely modern Koreans' most direct linguistic and cultural ancestors. In the 3rd century, however, they were still far from unified. The 3 were Mahan in the southwest, Pyeonhan in the center, and Chinhan in the southeast. According to the Chinese account, Chinhan and Mahan did not speak the same language. In the 3rd century, the Chinese described Mahan as a collection of over 50 countries, guo. These countries were small agricultural communities scattered between the mountains and the sea, without walled cities. The largest reportedly contained over 10,000 households, and the smallest only a few thousand. Pyeonhan and Chinhan were less populous, each with only a dozen somewhat smaller countries. In Pyeonhan and Chinhan, for example, people tattooed their bodies and used stones to compress the heads of newborn babies into an artificially narrow shape. Pyeonhan was also notable as a major producer of iron for the entire region. The people of Koguryo, in the north, were highlanders who occupied rugged mountainous terrain and lacked any very satisfactory agricultural base. In the 3rd century, their population was approximately 30,000 households. They were allegedly warlike and rode small ponies, adept at clambering over the mountains. Koguryo is known for its hill forts, and its capitals typically combined a mountain citadel with a residential city on the plain. In striking contrast to the most typical Chinese marriage practice in which the bride moves in with her husband's parents, in Koguryo, it was said that the husband moved into a smaller son-in-law's house constructed behind the bride's parents' home, and the newly married couple continued to live there until their own children were adults. 3 Kingdoms, Korea, 313–668. Koguryo, which seems to have originally coalesced just north of the Yalu River, was the first of the communities in Korea to form an organized territorial kingdom, the first of the formative Korean 3 kingdoms, Samguk. In the year 32 CE, the Koguryo leader, for the first time, supposedly took the Chinese title King Wang. With the gradual weakening of the Chinese Han dynasty, Koguryo began raiding the Han borders in the early 2nd century. After the total collapse of the Han dynasty by 220, southern Manchuria, not to mention northern Korea, was left with a political vacuum that was filled by the rise of various non-Chinese Xianbei regimes and Koguryo. Early in the 3rd century, a subgroup of the Xianbei, known as the Murong, moved into southwestern Manchuria, likely from further west. They aided the Chinese 3 kingdoms state of Wei in subduing local independent Chinese warlords and established a Murong state. The Murong eventually gave rise to 5 distinct states during the 16 Kingdoms era known as Yan, Although the ruling family of the last state, Northern Yan, is believed to have been of Chinese descent rather than Murong, it still reflected the cultural influence of the Xianbei. Despite the rise of the Murong, until as late as 353, the Murong chieftains accepted titles from the Chinese Western and Eastern Jin dynasties, thus preserving a thin pretense of continued Chinese rule in the area long after it had ceased to have much reality. Eventually, however, the Murong leaders took the Chinese imperial title for themselves, and for a few years, the Murong-ruled former Yan dynasty, 349–370, even conquered and ruled most of northeast China. These Murong Xianbei also interacted extensively with Proto-Korean Koguryo, at one point reducing Koguryo to a vassal state. In 342, the Murong sacked Koguryo's capital, capturing over 50,000 people. A few years earlier, in 336, a man named Dong Shou, d. 357, had escaped from a factional dispute in the Murong state in southern Manchuria by fleeing to Koguryo, where he apparently became locally prominent. In 357, he passed away and laid to rest some distance southwest of the present-day capital of North Korea. His impressive tomb contains an inscription written in Chinese claiming official Chinese titles and murals depicting, among other things, the new style of heavily armored cavalry. This tomb is a fascinating example of this period's complicated patterns of cultural exchange and ambiguous identity. Dong Shou may, perhaps, have been of Chinese descent and was clearly a participant in Chinese-style literate high culture, but he was probably also, culturally, somewhat mixed. His tomb is in the Koguryo style, and he had lived as an accepted member of the elite among both the non-Chinese Murong Xianbei and Proto-Korean Koguryoans. The Murong Xianbei were eventually conquered and absorbed by the Tuoba Xianbei, while Koguryo recovered from its setbacks and grew stronger. By the mid-5th century, the chaos of the Age of the 16 Kingdoms, 304–439, had stabilized into two large and powerful states in northern East Asia. The Tuoba Xianbei-ruled Northern Wei dynasty in North China and Koguryo in southern Manchuria and northern Korea. Both states had non-Chinese rulers, although Northern Wei presumably had a Chinese majority subject population. Still, both Northern Wei and Koguryo had also by this time absorbed a substantial amount of Chinese culture, helping to convert the Tuoba Xianbei, Northern Wei, into a reasonable facsimile of a legitimate Chinese dynasty, and touching off a process of secondary state formation in East Asia that would eventually extend the length of the Korean peninsula and across the sea to Japan. In 372, Koguryo established an academy for studying the Chinese classics, and in 373, Koguryo promulgated its first Chinese-style law codes. In 427, Koguryo moved its capital from what is today the Chinese side of the Yalu River in Manchuria to the vicinity of modern Pyongyang in northern Korea. By this time, Koguryo's attention was increasingly directed toward the domination of the Korean peninsula. Korean legend holds that a son of Koguri's founder founded Paekje, the second of the Korean Three Kingdoms. Like Koguryo, therefore, the Paekje royal line claimed Puyo descent. Paekje was initially only one of the more than 50 small countries in the Mahan region of southwestern Korea, and it took shape out of the gradual consolidation of those Mahan communities with a presumably predominantly Mahan population, whether or not its rulers really were of Puyo descent. The first recorded contact between Paekje and a Chinese dynasty occurred in 372, and by 386, the Paekje ruler had received Chinese titles such as General Garrisoning the East and King of Paekje. The keeping of written records also reportedly began in Paekje around the mid-4th century. During the 5th and 6th centuries, Paekje enjoyed close relations with southern dynasty China, evolving into a highly sophisticated Chinese-style kingdom. At the same time, Paekje also had important ties with the newly emerging state of Japan. A community named Saro, in the Chinhan region of southeastern Korea, gave rise to the Third Korean Kingdom, Silla. This was the farthest and slowest developing Korean three-kingdom. It was not until 503 that Sillan leaders finally abandoned native titles, such as Marzipan, and took the Chinese title King. The country first standardized Silla as its name in 503. In 520, Silla promulgated its first Chinese-style law codes. Around 535, Silla overcame opposition to Buddhism and officially endorsed it. In 545, by royal command, Silla began compiling a written kingdom history. What the Koreans were learning from China in these centuries were the institutions and techniques of state building. The Korean Three Kingdoms, despite the spread of Chinese influences, particularly in writing, were characterized by warrior aristocracies distinct from the Chinese literati elite, and many aspects of their traditional native culture endured. Most people in Koguryo continued to live in simple thatched huts with only royal palaces, government offices, and Buddhist temples adopting heavy Chinese-style tiled roofs. Simultaneously, there could have been even broader connections. Silla's gold crowns and jewelry in the 5th century suggest northern links with Koguri and the Janbei, extending beyond Siberia and Afghanistan, and exchanges with maritime South Asia. Aside from their obvious distinctions from the Chinese, these three early Korean kingdoms also differed in language and customs. Each had, for example, their own distinctive ceramic traditions. The monumental tumuli, called Old Tombs, Kofun, that appeared in each of the three kingdoms between the 4th and 7th centuries, had somewhat different regional styles. Stone burial chambers with painted murals in Koguryo, arched brick chambers in Payeche, and wooden coffins piled over with stone in Silla. The three kingdoms were also more or less constantly at war with each other. At the same time, however, they were continuously exchanging influences. They would finally unite for the first time in the 7th century, marking what could be considered the birth of Korea. Yamato Japan. The Japanese islands have yielded some of the world's earliest known pottery. These early ceramics mark the beginning, around 11,000 BCE, of what archaeologists call the Jomon period of Japanese prehistory. The word Jomon literally means cord pattern in Japanese. It refers to a decorative pattern produced by making impressions in the wet clay with cords. Despite Japan's remarkably early breakthrough into ceramic culture, the prehistoric inhabitants of Japan long remained primarily hunter-gatherers. The total population remained sparse, probably never exceeding roughly 250,000. Nevertheless, even though agriculture was little developed, Jomon period people eventually settled into permanent villages of perhaps 30 to 50 persons, who caught their food with bows and traps and rowed dugout canoes to fish with harpoons, hooks, and nets. They consumed so much seafood that piles of discarded shellfish often still mark the sites of their villages. We have observed tantalizing hints of southern cultural influences on Japan, resemblances to prehistoric Southeast China and later Southeast Asia. These include customs, such as the construction of wooden homes elevated above the ground on posts. Some of these southern traits, such as rice cultivation, did not appear in Japan until the end of the Jomon period, and others cannot be verified until relatively later, such as tattooing the body. Some, however, can be detected already in Jomon times, such as ritual tooth extraction of canines or incisors, perhaps to celebrate rites of passage to puberty or marriage, a fascination with comma-shaped decorative beads called magatama, and a fondness for boats and seamanship. Japan's prehistoric culture then underwent some fairly dramatic changes beginning around 300 BCE, when the predominant direction of influence also shifted to the north, especially now from the Korean peninsula. These influences included significant new genetic contributions to the population of the islands, sufficient to indicate either enormous numbers of new immigrants, some estimates reach as high as 1 million, or a relatively small group that succeeded in reproducing itself disproportionately after arrival. Other new introductions included wet field rice cultivation and metallurgy, and possibly even the Japanese language itself, which is thought to be distantly related to Korean. We call this new phase of prehistoric culture Yayoi, roughly 3rd century BCE, 3rd century CE. At the end of the Yayoi period, the oldest written description of Japan finally appears. Similar to the case of Korea, a Chinese source provides this information. The Chinese Chronicles of the Three Kingdoms, Sangguo Ji, compiled in the late 3rd century, contains a fascinating brief account of Japan based on diplomatic contact. It describes a land called Yamatai, formed from a coalition of some 30 smaller entities and ruled by a princess named Himiko, who excelled at magic and lived in a fortified palace with 1,000 female attendants, but who was rarely seen in public. A younger brother assisted in her rule. In modern Japan, there has been intense historical controversy over whether Himiko's realm of Yamatai was located in northern Kyushu, the southwesternmost of Japan's 4 largest islands, and the point of nearest approach to the Korean peninsula, or on the large plain at the eastern end of the inland sea on the main island. This plain has traditionally been known as the Yamato Plain, and it was home to the imperial capital for most of recorded Japanese history. The obvious similarity between the names Yamatai and Yamato is tantalizingly suggestive. There is also mention of a large earthen tomb built for Princess Himiko following her death, as similar disturbances started to occur around this time, primarily in the Yamato Plain region. However, the exact location of Himiko's kingdom of Yamatai remains uncertain. Although the Himiko story suggests some attempts at authority consolidation, it is evident that Japan remained divided among multiple small communities as of the 3rd century. We can also observe that the Yamatai described in this 3rd century Chinese account is, in some ways, already recognizably Japanese in culture. Archaeologists speak of an old tomb Kofun period in Japan, covering roughly 250–552 CE. The largest of these massive earthen old tombs is 100 feet high and covers 80 acres. Interestingly, the tumuli of roughly contemporary Three Kingdoms Korea also use the term old tomb. Despite the word's pronunciation as Kofun in Japanese and Kobun in Korean, the same 2 Chinese characters appear in both forms. To some extent, of course, the creation of tumuli for deceased world leaders may have merely been a general phenomenon. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, and other Chinese emperors also had large earthen mounds heaped over their graves. Furthermore, many Japanese tombs are distinguished from old Korean tombs by their unique keyhole shape, which is round at one end and square at the other. However, researchers have discovered 14 uniquely Japanese-style keyhole-shaped tombs in extreme southwestern Korea, indicating frequent contact between the islands and the peninsula in these centuries. Fierce modern nationalistic debates over whether Japan conquered Korea or Korea conquered Japan in this period are largely misguided and anachronistic, if only because neither Japan nor Korea existed as a coherent identity. However, people from the Japanese islands apparently did have some presence on the Korean peninsula in these early centuries, and the Japanese islands clearly did absorb several highly critical influences from the peninsula, including such technologies as stirrups and armor. By the 5th century, northern Wei, Xianbei, or Chinese, and Koguryo-style heavily armored cavalry had appeared in Japan. Additionally, a significant number of actual immigrants from the continent were present in Japan. Early historical Japan openly acknowledged this. In a record of 1,059 prominent families living in the capital region compiled in 815, for example, some 30% were explicitly said to be of foreign descent. In these critical centuries, at the dawn of Japanese history, immigrants played a vital role in shaping the emerging Japanese state. Japan's mountainous terrain naturally divides the islands into separate local communities. But the main island of Honshu is also blessed with two significantly large plains. The largest of these, the Kanto Plain in the east, around modern Tokyo, was too remote from continental influences to figure significantly in early state formation. But the Yamato Plain in the west, at the eastern end of the inland sea, was well situated to become the heart of a major agricultural civilization. By contrast, Korea's relative lack of comparably large, flat land areas may have constrained Korea's pre-modern development somewhat. Because of the critical importance of imported continental technologies, such as ironworking and wet-field rice. Cultivation in early Japan, the regions closest to and most accessible from the continent, northern Kyushu and the inland sea area, including the Yamato Plain, quickly became the most developed areas. Archaeological evidence indicates that consolidated rule had somewhat subjugated the Yamato Plain by the 400s. At various times, newly emerging East Asian rulers in Manchuria, Korea, and Japan attempted to strengthen their positions against potential rivals by offering tribute to Chinese dynasties and receiving prestigious Chinese titles. In 238, the Three Kingdoms Chinese state of Wei proclaimed Himiko as Queen of Wa, the earliest written name for Japan. Chinese dynasty histories mention 13 Japanese tribute missions between 413 and 502. One of the titles the Chinese southern dynasties bestowed on 5th century Japanese rulers was Great General Pacifying the East. This original Chinese title, General, Jiangjun, is pronounced Shogun in Japanese, and it is a word that would have a prominent future in Japan. Even in this early period when emerging Japanese leaders were still actively seeking titles from China, however, an inscription on a sword that was buried in western Kyushu in the late 5th or early 6th century already speaks of a Japanese great king ruling all under heaven, revealing that the Japanese were already beginning to adapt and apply continental ideas of supreme sovereignty to themselves. The court's ability to control and monopolize the distribution of imported foreign prestige goods, such as iron, imported from Korea in the earliest period, bronze mirrors, and swords, played a significant role in the rise of centralized royal authority in Yamato Japan, especially in the period from the 5th through the early 7th centuries. This also included control over groups of immigrants with useful specialized skills, such as writing. By the 5th century, record-keeping began at the Japanese court, with immigrants forming the nucleus of a literate scribal class. Immigrant artisans were often organized into special hereditary production units called bi. In addition to writing, immigrants dominated key crafts such as silk weaving, metalworking, and architecture in the 5th and 6th centuries. The Yamato court also attempted to gain leverage over the major native Japanese descent groups, called uji, which were the primary organizational units of early Japanese society, by conferring new titles as surnames on their leaders, and converting these leaders into orientations of dependency on the Yamato court. This uji often claimed descent from deities, kami in Japanese, and cohered around shared worship of those deities. In particular, the Japanese imperial line claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. Over time, they successfully engineered the ascent of this sun goddess to the top of the religious hierarchy. Early Japan closely intertwined politics and religion uniquely in East Asia. One Japanese word for government, matsurigoto, derives from a word meaning matters of religious ritual. During this early phase, not only did the Yamato ruler not yet refer to himself, or herself, a striking number of female rulers existed in early Japan, as emperor, but they had not yet conceived the posthumous names by which the early Japanese rulers are known today. Contemporaries apparently merely referred to the earliest Japanese rulers by the names of the palaces where they lived. By the 6th century, however, Yamato leaders had begun proclaiming themselves true sovereigns, Sumera Mikoto. In 587, one Yamato ruler supposedly indicated a willingness to accept Buddhism's foreign, continental religious doctrines. Political opposition stiffened, and when the ruler died later that same year, a coalition of 5 royal princes, together with the head of the powerful Soga family, marched against the leaders of the opposition and annihilated them. The Soga family had been early supporters of Buddhism and had risen to immense power by attaching themselves closely to the service of the throne, eventually attaining the title of senior minister. After their victory in this swift civil war of 587, the Soga family emerged as the dominant personality in Japan. In 592, the Soga leader even audaciously arranged the assassination of the reigning monarch and the installation of his own niece, who is known to history as Empress Suiko, R. 592-628, on the throne, now located in a new palace in the heart of the Soga family stronghold, near Asuka, in the Yamato region. Empress Suiko and her renowned regent Prince Shotoku, Shotoku Taishi, 574-622, became associated with various important innovations that helped transform Yamato into a more continental-style centralized state. These new developments may have included the first adoption of such Chinese titles as emperor, written with 2 characters pronounced Kotei in Japanese and Huangdi in Chinese. However, what would become the distinctively Japanese variant of this East Asian imperial title, Heavenly Sovereign, Tenno, was not first used until the end of the 7th century. In 604, Prince Shotoku also supposedly issued a landmark 17-article constitution that outlined a new vision of an ethical and political order based on a combination of Confucian and Buddhist ideals and asserted an unprecedented royal monopoly on ultimate authority throughout Japan, stating flatly that, in a country there are not 2 lords, the people have not 2 masters. Although Japan's 2 earliest native histories, the Record of Ancient Matters, Kojiki, completed in 712, and the Chronicles of Japan, Nihon Shoki, also known as the Nihongi, completed in 720, purport to describe Japanese history from the primordial creation of the islands and date the beginning of the alleged first Japanese emperor's reign to 660 BCE. Much of this early material is clearly legendary. It is only now, roughly around the time of Empress Suiko, that we can begin to read these accounts as reasonably reliable history. Even at this time, much of the northern part of the main island of Honshu, southern Kyushu, and other outlying islands were still largely outside the pale of Japanese civilization. However, this era marked the birth of Japan in important senses.